Hello, and gosh, that's a bit loud. Hello, and welcome to David Starkey Talks. I'm not quite sure I'm actually believing this, but we're talking in the Sheldonian, the grandest possible building in Oxford, constructed in the immediate aftermath of that first great restoration in 1660 to represent the new power of the monarchy, and an Oxford flourishing in having been cavalier as opposed to my own deplorable university on the other side. To add to the sense of ultra-establishment, this is the Oxford Literary Festival, and to cap, I think, one's feeling of being welcomed by establishment, I'm delighted to be talking to Jeremy Hunt, and we were trying to work out whether he was the longest-serving cabinet minister in the government of 2010 to 2014, and we came to the conclusion the only possible rival was actually Michael Gove. So I think we will leave that hanging in the air. And Jeremy, like everybody else at a literary festival, has written a book last year called Can We, that's Britain, Be Great Again? A sort of deliberate echo of MAGA, but with a profoundly different message. When I read the book, which I did a little while ago and then reread it this morning, the first word that came to me, and I'm hoping this gets Jeremy very cross, was Panglossian. Do you remember the Dr. Pangloss in Voltaire's novel Candide, who believed that we were in the best of all possible worlds? How would you respond to that charge? Because it is, isn't it? You tell me in this book, let's just look at today's news. You tell me in this book that we remain the Europe's greatest military power. Citing statistics of 2019, today I read that one of the leading generals in the Defence Review says, on a good day, we might be able to take a small town. So, you see why I say Panglossian.
I think we're going to really enjoy this afternoon, and I'm absolutely delighted to say not guilty. If Panglossian means unrealistic to the point of ridicule, then absolutely not.
No, it wasn't ridiculing.
No.
It was presenting evidence.
Yes, I know, and I'm about to present the evidence as to why it's not Panglossian, because the truth is that all Europe's defences are in a shockingly bad state, not just the UK's.
France did rather better.
Well, hang on. You've got to let me answer the question, haven't you, David? And no, I think actually the UK's defence forces are about the same as France's. But what I would say is that we all need to do a lot better on defence. And if we are going to stand on our own 2 feet and not be pushed around by America or Russia or the other great powers, then we need to be able to defend ourselves. And Britain is one of only a tiny handful of countries that is willing to project power outside its own region. We have incredible traditions in our armed forces, and we need to do something about that. We need to make the most of those tremendous traditions. So my argument in this book is not that everything is hunky-dory. It's actually quite the opposite. I think the world is more dangerous than at any time since the Cold War, when we worried about nuclear conflagration. But in that situation, the most dangerous thing of all is to underestimate your own abilities, your own capabilities. And we have always been one of Europe's leading defense powers, if not the leading defense power. And this is a time when countries need to roll up their sleeves and play their part in making the world safer. And actually, if you said to me, and this was something when I was Foreign Secretary, I used to give all these speeches about how brilliant Britain was at this and that. And, that's part of your job as Foreign Secretary. You're sort of salesman in chief for the country. And I thought, what is it that people really want from Britain? What's the single thing we could do that could most add value in the world? And I thought, actually, it is to keep the world safe, because most people recognize that we have historically had very good armed forces, and we don't want to go back to a world of might is right. I don't agree with Donald Trump on that, and I don't want to see the world carved up between America, China, and Russia, and I think that's a profoundly dangerous vision of the world. Well, those of us with a different view, if we want to have the influence to exercise it, then we need things like strong armed forces.
This is infinitely unrealistic, isn't it? Let's again look frankly at the last few weeks. The last few weeks brought about by Trump's intervention in Iran. There is that wonderful remark about Warren Buffett that you only see who is wearing a swimming costume when the tide goes out. The revelation of Britain's absolute nakedness in defence. It has been genuine national humiliation. The ambiguity of our conduct, the inability of us to put a ship in the right place, the fundamental questions over the serviceability, the fact that so much of it is out of operation, the immediate revelations about the catastrophe of the Ajax program. You're talking a good talk, but there is absolutely no connection with reality. We've just heard repeatedly from our leading generals, leading defense experts, that we are effectively naked. We spend more on defense than Israel, with infinitely less effect. But let's just pick another idea, that we have a generalized duty to world peace. This seems to me to be a very, very odd notion. Only the kind of power that we were in the 19th century can possibly do that. You are talking, the guardian of world peace has got to be a hegemon. The last time we had remotely the powers of a hegemon is about 1918.
Well, okay, let me deal with some of the nonsense in what you've just said. First of all, the book actually, chapter 1 of the book is all about defense. And there's probably about 10 pages that go into enormous detail about the terrible shortcomings in our defense offer. I don't pull my punches on that. It's one of the reasons why, incidentally, I increased defense spending to 2.5% when I was Chancellor, because it's something I felt very strongly about. But, I went to a conference last year in which I heard one of the most senior American admirals in the US Navy, who's responsible for the Indo-Pacific Fleet. So if the balloon goes up in Taiwan, he'll be the man responsible. And he said a really interesting phrase. He said, "Hope is the first duty of command." And I have to say, the kind of negativity that I heard from you just then, David, reminded me of the 365 economists who wrote into the Times saying that Margaret Thatcher's economic policies were wholly wrong. And I have to say that I accept 100% your charge that our armed forces are not able to do what we need them to do, and we need to do a lot more, and we need to do it fast. But I don't accept that we can't get them to the place they need to be. And I would say that if there is a country that has the potential outside the United States, if there's a democracy that has the potential to build up its armed forces so that they can be a force for good in the world, then it's probably the US, Britain, France, perhaps Australia and Canada. But it's a very small list. And the question is whether we actually are prepared to roll up our sleeves and do that. And am I saying that we're going to be the world's policeman on our own? Of course not. Completely unrealistic. But should we work together with other countries who say that we don't want to go back to a world in which might is right, in which countries are able to just invade their neighbors? Well, it just so happens there are lots of other countries that agree with that. Japan, Korea, Taiwan, Australia, New Zealand, Canada. And I think one day America as well, because I don't think that Trump is America. And I think that we should always hold the door open to the world's most powerful democracy, however much we worry about the direction it's gone of late.
I think we do actually agree on the fundamentals. What I'm trying to say is, in the world as it is now, with Keir Starmer as Prime Minister, the chances of any of this happening are infinitely remote. I mean, he has promised to increase defence expenditure, but not yet. You quote St. Augustine in the book. He is constantly St. Augustine. Give me defence, but not yet. And you know perfectly, you of all people, with your experience as Chancellor, how absolutely unrealistic it is at the moment to think any extra money can be found for anything, it seems to me. That we are looking at, I mean, look, for example, you succeeded as Chancellor in the immediate wake of Liz Truss. In the last few days, there were moments when guilt actually went higher than in that crisis. We are at the absolute financial margins. People are talking openly. Today in the Times, Paul Ovenden, who, believe it or not, I find it difficult to believe, but Keir Starmer apparently had a director of strategy. Can you believe? I mean, seeing absolutely no evidence of any strategy on anything. He says we are at a moment of 1976, or we're at a moment of Suez, that we are on a knife edge. And we're on a knife edge, of course, without leadership. Can we just, again, you said that your book offered a message of hope. I think it does. But haven't we to be more realistic? I mean, let's shift slightly now to the consequences of that 14 years and the 11 of those that you served as a cabinet minister. The Conservative Party experienced its worst ever defeat, and you barely hung on to a seat in leafy Surrey. Now, doesn't that suggest perhaps that something rather structural went wrong? And I can't see any trace in what you write that there's an awareness of that.
Okay, let's unpick. You've jumped around there a bit, David. Let me just say
it's called moving the discussion on.
Or even moving the goalposts. So let me just be clear. This book is about Britain's role in the world. Mm-hmm. And it's called Can We Be Great Again? And my definition of great is not Donald Trump's definition of great. My definition is a very straightforward one. I say a great country is one that can shape the world as well as be shaped by it. And I still believe, despite the incredibly disappointing, depressing failures of modern Britain today, that we are a country that can continue to shape the world. And this is what I make the argument for in this book. But I don't, and I think it's very important to say, I don't gloss over in any way at all the problems that we face as a country, but it's about what we can do in the world. Now, you talked about Keir Starmer. I don't think it's going to surprise people in here if I reveal, shock, horror, probe, scandal, that I am not a supporter of Keir Starmer's government. So I very much hope it is like 1976 and that we are 3 years away from a determined new Conservative government that will start another process of national renewal. And that's why I stood as a Conservative MP, and that's what I believe in. So I'm not going to waste any time criticising the Conservative government. If you're saying, what happened in 2024 and was there something structural? And I'm going to try and be as non-partisan as I can, although it's obviously difficult to be completely objective, having been in the cabinet for 11 of those 14 years. We didn't get everything right, for sure. We made big mistakes. I can think of a number of big ones, but I think migration is probably the one that stands out the most. But the truth is that after 14 years, people were very, very tired and they wanted a change. And it was a very difficult 14 years because something happened in that 14 years that has never happened in our lifetimes before. Normally what happened is that you have an economic crisis once in a generation, and then a government picks up the pieces, brings down the national debt, and then a decade or so later, maybe the same thing happens again. But in that period of 14 years, we had to cope with 3 crises in quick succession, global crises, the global financial crisis or the aftermath of it, COVID, and the Ukraine energy shock. And they were body blows to the economy, which meant that our growth rate never really recovered. We were never able to bring down our debt in between crises, which meant that our debt as a share of GDP went up. And that's why it was, after that period, it was a pretty difficult sell to say to people, things have got better, because actually people felt pretty browned off because so many things had gone wrong. Now, we didn't do, as I say, some things right, but I think the most important thing that people want from a Conservative government is to take the tough and difficult decisions to put the economy back on its feet. And without talking about my own record, if I look at George Osborne when he became Chancellor, £1 in every 4 that the government was spending in 2010 was being borrowed. So an NHS that cost £100 billion a year, we were borrowing £25 billion. That's how shot to pieces our national finances were. He cut spending far more savagely than Margaret Thatcher ever did. She cut it by, I think, 2%. In the biggest year that she ever cut it, it was by 3%. He cut it over 4 years by 19%. And we're still unpopular today for the austerity period, and not all of the decisions that we took were right. But the principle, which was that we need to get the deficit down and get the economy back growing again, that was something that he took those difficult decisions. So, are there structural things wrong with our democracy? As it happens, I think there are.
Would you like to list them?
Yes, I think that. I think when I look at the challenge of, for example, trying to get the economy growing, which was something that I was very intricately involved with as Chancellor, I think we have passed laws that just make it too long and too difficult to get things done. So if Parliament decides that we want to build a nuclear power station and votes for it, and the Treasury agrees to provide the money, it takes 15 years before, as a minimum, before the nuclear power station opens. That is far too long. If we want to build a high-speed rail line between London and Birmingham, we end up having to build a tunnel to protect bats that costs £100 million, a total of something like £300,000 per bat saved. If we want to get houses built, it takes an infinitely long process, with the result that young people find it hard to get on the housing ladder. And there are various reasons why this has happened, but a lot of it is laws that we have passed, laws that, incidentally, outside the European Union, we have a lot more freedom to remove than we did before, but we haven't. And I do think that that has reduced people's confidence. I think people have a nagging worry that the politicians they send to Westminster just aren't able to solve the big problems.
But you were in power, or rather, the Conservatives were in power from 2010 to 2014. This structure of law that you talk about was a deliberate creation of the Blair government. There was a deliberate intention to override anybody that had democratic accountability with the creation of a legal and expert structure. I've written about this at length, the shift of power to the 440-odd quangos, the quasi-autonomous non-governmental organizations, which certainly before the attempted demolition of the NHS quango, which was set up under the Conservative government, controlled roughly a third of state expenditure, with the deliberate view that the public could not actually have any, or indeed any politician, have any direct say, hence English nature, hence the Butt Tunnel, hence the even larger fish disco for the, the nuclear power station, the Butt Tunnel of 100 and the 100 million, and the fish disco 600 million. Again, the judicial power you refer to, deliberately the creation of the Supreme Court, of the exaggerated rights of judicial review, of the Equality Act, of the ECHR, you did nothing. You also entrenched all of these things. The thing that is ultimately disastrous, which is, facing us now with an immediate cost of living crisis, is the decision in 2015, the decision in 2015, which wasn't even subject to a formal, I think, an act of Parliament. It was simply a statutory instrument to bring forward net zero to 2050, which effectively gives judges control over extractive policy. These weren't simply that you didn't reverse what Labour had done, you actually intensified it, didn't you? I mean, again, your book has got, one of the things that I found striking about your book, it could have been written by any centrist Labour politician. Exactly the same sort of things that you feature: climate change, human rights, soft power, creative industries. They're just absolute common ground. This is the stuff of the Uniparty, isn't it?
Well, no, for one very simple reason, which is exactly how you started this interview. This book says one of the most important things we need to do is to increase defence spending, and Keir Starmer's not doing that. And you and I both know that a Conservative government would do that. So it's about
it
what
didn't.
you... Well, actually, I did. I increased defence spending to 2.5%.
Bye.
It's very easy to say that, David.
But so it's
no,
true.
hang on. It's very easy to say that out of context. Remember, when I became Chancellor, markets were in free fall, inflation was 11%, the economy was predicted to be facing the longest recession in 100 years, and defence spending, which for more than a decade had been at 2% of GDP, to find the resources to increase it to 2.5%, by the way, I think it needs to be even higher, was a big deal. And I don't apologise for that at all. I did the work to make sure we could do it, and now I want us to go further. But I totally reject your suggestion that it's a very easy Nigel Farage line to talk about the Uniparty. It's bollocks. Let's be clear. Yes, it is. And let me give you the evidence. When David Cameron came to office, we abolished nearly 150 of those quangos. Another 150 were merged into other quangos. I know, because I was responsible for 53 of them at the Department of Culture, Media and Sport, and I had to find about a dozen to get rid of. Francis Maude's civil service reform programme cut the size of the civil service by 20%, a huge reduction in the number of civil servants. But I won't pretend that at that time, the biggest challenge we faced as a country was financial. We were about to go bankrupt, and the biggest focus of David Cameron and George Osborne was how to reduce the deficit. So I'm sure there were woke laws from the Blair era that we left in place.
You added to them.
Well, okay, I think the one that you think we added to is one where we will probably have a disagreement, because I do believe that we should live up to our responsibilities on climate change. I think that we have made a big mistake in our climate change policy, which is that we've adopted policies that have given us the most expensive energy prices in the developed world, and that is holding back the economy. So I think that was a mistake in our approach. But do I broadly think that we should be responsible when it comes to protecting the planet and setting an example when it comes to CO2 emissions? I do. I think that's a good thing. So on that one, I think we will probably have a disagreement.
But equally, the way, I mean, again, one may dispute and I don't. I mean, it seems to me that anything that one can do to alleviate the hideousness of smogs and the kind of things that we see in China and whatever that we used to have here is wholly welcome.
Climate change is not just about pollution. It's about much bigger.
I'm aware.
Risk to the planet.
I'm aware, but it has surely become a religion, and the notion that we've got a duty to set an example. This is an arrogance. This is a vanity to think that anybody is going to change their behavior, looking at Britain and saying, gosh, they're such an admirable country. I mean, have you seen the Chinese smitten with the notion that they really ought to follow our example? India? I don't. Sorry, this seems to me to touch something absolutely fundamental. That one of the central things in your book, I think, forgive me, is a vanity. The notion of soft power is pure vanity. Power is real. Power depends on the ability to muster force. The shame of Britain over the last few weeks demonstrates when you try to strut above your strength. Soft power is an illusion. It's a myth. It's a comforting myth that we've sold ourselves. It was part of the late imperial notion of liberal empire that we were there for the benefit of the natives. And it is simply that vanity projected into a post-imperial world. But can I just, again...
No, I think you've got to let me respond.
Okay,
because
fine.
If you're going to talk nonsense, then you have to let someone respond to it.
You use the word... I never accuse you of talking nonsense.
But you've made very direct comments about the arguments in my book, so I'm going to make very direct comments about the nonsense you're talking. And the example I want to give is from this very university. So when I was a student at Magdalen College in 1985, I came up. I was perhaps the only Tory in my college. There weren't very many of us, but I was a proud supporter of Margaret Thatcher. And I had a Chinese friend who was a postgraduate student who came over to study with her husband. And I bumped into her one day in the quadrangle, and she said, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm going to a JCR debate where I have to speak in defense of the poll tax." It wasn't my most popular wicket at the time. And so I said, "Do you want to come along?" And she came along. And then we had actually... I was literally the only person in the room speaking in favor of the poll tax, and everyone was against me. But it was a good student debate, and it was very good humoured. And she obviously was quite curious because the person speaking for the government was in a minority of one, and yet we were having a good-natured, good-humoured debate. We both left the college in 1988, and she went on to become one of the demonstrators in Tiananmen Square. Now, I don't know if it had anything to do with that experience, but I do know that when she arrived, she was a strong supporter of the Communist Party and a strong supporter of Chairman Mao. And something about being here changed her view. And that is what I mean. And Oxford is one of the greatest universities in the world. And one of the reasons it is a great university is because it attracts brilliant minds from all over the world who then go back to their countries with whatever it is that they picked up here. Now, I'm not prepared to chuck all that away and say that that kind of soft power is vanity. That is absolute rubbish. That is one of the most...
I'm not. But for the simple reason, Jeremy, you're now giving us a sweet little anecdote about
It's not
Oxford.
a sweet anecdote. It's an example.
It's a very important one. And unlike you, I've been a university teacher. I believed in this. I practiced it.
Okay.
It is centrally important. But that is not national. That is not the projection of the kind of myth that I'm talking about. That is a specific institution, one that I would passionately defend too. We're talking about something else. We're talking about the antics on the public stage. We're talking about the mouthing of platitudes, the shaking of hands, the kind of activities you undertook as foreign secretary.
In this book, hang on, in this book, I do point out that we are ranked third in the world globally by independent consultancies for the extent of our so-called soft power. That's the sort of the reach and the influence of our culture. And one of the most important factors in that ranking is the fact that we have 400,000 students from all over the world who come and study in British universities, second only to the United States. And that's one of the reasons they give us that ranking, and they describe Britain as having soft power. Now, you did just describe that as vanity, and I'm saying it's not vanity, it's actually something very important. And I think that if you're, and I do believe, by the way, I don't want a world in which just Britain is okay. I actually think so. The things that I believe in, treating people with dignity and respect, freedom and democracy, they're things that actually are important for all human beings. So if you are, let me finish my point. So if you are an African country and you're thinking, do I go in the autocracy direction, because China seems to be doing very well, or do I go in the democracy direction, then whether things are working in the UK actually has an influence. Now, at the moment, they're not working terribly well. They're not working terribly well in America. The two great exponents of democracy, the two countries that between them set up the international order, have both got massive issues. And I want us to sort those out, because I do think that the power of example is something very important.
Do you really think that how we conduct ourselves will make the faintest impression on 99% of Africa? Do you actually believe that this endeavor, which was very much part, again, I talked about liberal empire, to introduce democracy in Africa, it's surely a simple absurdity. Tribal societies cannot democratize. If we've not learned that lesson from Afghanistan, from Libya, from virtually everywhere that we've tried it, we constantly tie ourselves in knots. I mean, I'm fascinated by this. I think we're now getting to the absolutely fundamental question. This is why I said I felt you really were part. And I'm not using it as a term of abuse. I'm not doing a Farage. I'm trying to analyze why I think you are part of that world. You seem to me, you'll be familiar with David Goodhart's two categories of the somewheres, the rooted, and the anywheres, those believers in universalism. You are fundamentally a universalist. You believe, you've just said now, all human beings are entitled to this, that, the other. But isn't that, A, a deep myth, and B, isn't it profoundly unconservative? Can I remind you of the, by far the greatest leader of the Conservative Party, not the greatest Conservative Prime Minister? Can I remind you of Disraeli? In the speech after he'd given the vote to my ancestors, because my father was a toolmaker as well, so the skilled working class in 1867. In that great speech that he gives first in Edinburgh and then in the Free Trade Hall, he justifies it. And he said, in a progressive country, and Britain, this is seventh decade of the 19th century, Britain is a progressive country. Change is inevitable. And interestingly, the Oxford Dictionary of Quotations scandalously abbreviates the quotation at that point, because what Disraeli went on to say was, it's not a question that there will be change, there will be, it's what sort of change. Is it change in accordance with the traditions and customs of the country, Burke, or is it change in accordance with rootless, international, liberal cosmopolitanism? You are a rootless, international, liberal cosmopolitan.
Well, all I can
Come on, boast about it. The whole book is about that.
Right, okay. Well, all I can do is say that I think you're completely wrong to say that conservatives don't believe that all human beings have aspirations to being treated decently, to living in a free country, to living in societies which treat them with decency and respect. That's not the same as saying that we have a duty and an obligation to impose that on other countries. And we should certainly recognize that we have made many mistakes when we've tried to do so, that the imposition of parliamentary democracy immediately post-independence in much of Africa was not successful, although interestingly, over time, there are some African countries where it's possible to see that it's actually beginning to thrive. I think of Ghana, for example, as one of those countries. But you can point to huge failures in Iraq and Afghanistan, and we should certainly absolutely recognize those failures. So this is not about imposing our system thoughtlessly on others, but that is not the same thing at all as saying that every human being aspires to living with the freedom and dignity and respect that we want for ourselves and our families. And I think they do. And we may have a difference there, but I think...
We do?
Well, I'm just telling you now, my wife's Chinese, and I can absolutely tell you, by the way, it doesn't make me rootless to be married to a foreigner. It doesn't make me any less British either way either to be married to a foreigner, but I can tell you that she absolutely understands the difference between a free society and a society that is not free. But my idea of Britain, I think, probably is different to yours, because yes, I do have an idea that the brilliant things that we have done in our country can be a force for good around the world, not by imposition, but by showing that we have found ways to make things work, that we can combine prosperity and fairness and all the things that actually, and I actually still believe that liberal democracy, for all its failings, is a better system than the alternatives on offer. The very fact that we're able to have this debate is something that's incredibly encouraging and not possible in the China-led autocracy bloc of the world. Now, my argument in the book, and by the way, I do say in the book that I think that if necessary, we should withdraw from the European Convention on Human Rights. And I say that with great reluctance, but I say it because in the end, I would prefer to reform it, but in the end, I think voters are entitled to expect their elected representatives, the people they send to Parliament, to be able to control who comes into the country and who leaves it. I think that's one of the fundamental things people expect. And if the other participants in the ECHR, because it's run by unanimity, are not prepared to go along with the reforms that are necessary to control illegal migration, stop illegal migration. So I'm perfectly prepared to take difficult decisions. But the view I have, which may be very different to yours, I don't know. I think if you step back and you look at the world we're in today, sadly, it's becoming quite similar to the 1980s in that it is a struggle between autocracy and democracy. And when I grew up in the 1980s, we couldn't take the future of democracy for granted because we had the Soviet Union that was there, that was willing and able to invade other countries to promote their own ideology and to constrain them under their yoke. And we knew that democracy might be something that we had to fight for. Well, I'm afraid I think we are now back in that same world where there is a global argument now between autocracy and democracy. And I do want Britain to play its part in helping to win that argument this century, just as we did in the last century. And I think we can do that. It'll be done in a different way to last time. But I think that is part of Britain's global vocation. I'm not someone who says we should just pull up the drawbridge and say, you know, sod the rest of the world, we're fine, thank you very much. No, that is not my view of Britain at all. I think we do have, at our best, a global vocation. But what I say is this: we are in a mess and we need to sort out that mess, because at the moment, we're not a great example of democracies working at their best. All the things that are going most badly wrong all the things that are causing anger and division, in the end, they're rooted in the challenges facing our economy. And so I think that is the central challenge now that we need to address.
I wonder if that's right, but let's just let's explore that in a moment. The one thing I do want to be clear about: I am second to none in the belief of freedom. I have paid a price for freedom of expression, so I will take no reproof on that issue. And but what I think we've got to be clear about is how we defend it. You
Can I
talk.
just ask you a question on that, David? So, if you are second to none in your belief in freedom, are you indifferent to whether people in a faraway country are free or not?
It is their choice.
I know it's their
It is,
choice. We
no,
all agree it's their choice.
I
but
am, right, let's be quite clear on this. This again, we're doing exactly what I hoped we would do. What has happened is we have had a constant diffusion of what should be an idea of national interest that has been dissolved. It's been like putting a powder into more and more water of good intentions. It's been further and further diluted. So we now have an entire governing class, in which I suspect you are part in that sense, that really doesn't much believe in the national interest. That is very clearly the case with Starmer. It is very clearly the case with Lord Hermer. And again, the kind of concerns that you talk about have led us to a stupid subordination, not simply to exaggerated views of human rights, but particularly international law, particularly the Chagos Islands. And I think if we are ever to come up with how do we begin to sort Britain out, there has to be that simple notion: the central duty of a British government is to Britain and is to the people of Britain. And until we do this, and this seems so infinitely obvious, but if you actually look at explicit statements, I mean, I mentioned Goodhart's book, there is the famous exchange in that, where Gus O'Donnell, Goodhart himself, and Mark Thompson, then the Director General of the BBC, were in conversation, needless to say, at an Oxford high table. And this subject came up. And Gus O'Donnell, who was a permanent Secretary of the Treasury, made entirely clear he did not see the well-being of Britain as his essential role. He saw global well-being. This is what we're getting at. And this seems to me to be a fundamental error. It's what Disraeli is talking about. And your constant appeal, until we have governments that address this very simple question, us first, stop talking about these vague general goals, we will get nowhere. And it just seems to me to be obvious.
So what, this is I've done... I'm just guessing here, but I must have done about 30 talks on my book, maybe 40 actually, since I published it last June. And this is by far the most interesting. So I really want to thank you for that. And it's interesting because we are getting to...
utter fundamentals.
Yeah, the nub of the point. And I want to answer this question by asking you to cast your mind across the Atlantic. Now, we have an American president who says that he wants America first. And I want to ask you, if you were an American, which is kind of what you're saying for Britain, the national interest, Britain first. And what that has involved is a series of decisions that I believe has made America a less great nation. I think it's made many Americans less proud of their country. It's made America come across as more arbitrary, less interested in democracy. You know, the abduction of Maduro, and not even bothering to think about the rights of a democratically elected government, but putting in place a new government where actually an absolutely brutal henchman has now become defense minister, and openly saying we're doing this because we want Venezuelan oil. I think that diminishes America. It doesn't make America great. So my vision for a great Britain is one which absolutely puts our national interests first. And please don't suggest that someone who writes a book saying we need to do difficult decisions to sort the economy out, we need to invest in our defense, we need to strengthen our global interest. Don't say to me that's not about putting our national interest first. It's just that I have a different view of our national interest to you. My view of our national interest is a country that is prosperous, successful, strong, and stands for a set of values that are admired across the world. That's why I was more proud to be British under Margaret Thatcher than any other prime minister in my lifetime, because that's what she did. And I think it's perfectly possible to put the national interest first, to be successful economically, and be a good example for the rest of the world. And that's why I'm not indifferent to people in other countries who aren't free. I recognize we can't change systems in other countries by force, but I don't think that means we don't do anything. I think we do what we can in a way that's consistent with our values and also consistent with our interests.
But equally, we are now in desperate stray. Thatcher was able to operate with the hegemon. She was able to operate with America in an extraordinarily close relationship most of the time with the American president. It turned out that, Russia had feet of clay. It turned out that circumstances were on her side. She managed to turn around the economy. We are now in desperate stray. And it seems to me we have to have a concentrated focus to begin with on ourselves. And I think, all I'm really trying to say is that we've got to start somewhere. And we've gone, I think you would agree, profoundly, badly astray.
Okay, I actually don't.
But let's move on.
No, because I think I just need to answer that point because I think that is an exaggeration. Look,
really?
yes, I do, and I'm going to give you some evidence, if I may, that that's an exaggeration. So I think if let's look at the area that is most commonly used to illustrate things have gone badly wrong, and it's our economy. And the truth is, we are currently the 6th largest economy in the world. And there's a London economics consultancy called the Centre for Economics and Business Research. And they do something very interesting. On Boxing Day every year, they publish a forecast of how big every economy in the world is and will be for each of the next 15 years. There's no other consultancy I've been able to find that does this. So I looked up, just before I published this book, what they say about the UK. We're the 6th largest at the moment, but things apparently, as you've just said, have gone so disastrously wrong. And most people think that's to do with the economy. Where is that terrible, effing disaster of a country, the UK, in 15 years' time? Well, as it happens, we're still 6th. In fact, what's happened is China, India, and America pull a bit further ahead, but we close the gap with Germany and with Japan. And then after I published this book last year, on Boxing Day this year, they republished their rankings for the next 15 years. And what do they say? They say, actually, in the next 15 years, we're going to overtake Japan, and we'll be the 5th largest economy. Now, that's because Japan's got some particular problems. But the reason I'm saying that is not to say everything is fantastic in our economy. Please don't get me wrong. The point I'm saying is that when we look at ourselves and saying everything is going to hell in a handcar, we sometimes forget that other countries have got problems as well. And we forget that they are also grappling with some of the big problems we face. Now, if we are going to be successful, if we are going to have that pride in ourselves, if we're going to be the country with the potential that I really believe we have to be a force for good in the world, a center of great influence, centered on our great universities amongst other places, then we have to sort out our economy. We have to sort out our defense. But perhaps the difference between you and me, I don't know, is that I have a profound belief we can. I really do. And I think I just want to go back to your point about Panglossianism, because I actually start this book with a quote by Lee Kuan Yew, who says, actually, I'm embarrassed to say,
It is there.
is it? I can't. Anyway, I know it by heart because it's one of my favorite quotes. But it's about realism. And Lee Kuan Yew, the founder of modern Singapore, says, if you are just realistic, you become pedestrian, you will fail. Therefore, you must find a way to soar above reality and say, this is also possible. What we are at the moment is a shadow of what we could be, and I make no apology.
Sorry, none of us disagrees.
Good.
Of course not.
I wouldn't have guessed it from some of your earlier comments, but that's great to know.
I'm simply trying to work out how we get from now to where you want to be. And pie in the sky, which is what you've been giving us, and motherhood, really, I'm sorry, this is true.
Pie in the sky?
This really is, sorry, again, this really is true. I think, again, even the figures that you've given are global figures for GDP. They're not GDP per head.
But GDP per head, we actually barely move. We're 21st, and I think
low.
Well, of course, there are countries like Luxembourg and Andorra and Monte Carlo that are much smaller than us, you know, the UAE. But 21st, I think we do go down a couple of places. We barely move. We're sort of at the bottom of the top 10%.
One final point, because time moves on. I don't know whether you've been keeping track of people like John Bew, of whom you would work, I imagine, as foreign policy advisor. Bew is on my side, not your side. Have you seen what he's been saying? That we are in a state of crisis that is comparable to the First World War, to the Second World War, and to Thatcher. And that we need, as a mere beginning, a radical reconstruction of government before we can do anything. Now, that's not me. That is somebody of profound experience, profoundly soaked in this world. He also is perfectly clear that the world that you talk about, the rules-based international order, is over, and that it cannot readily be resurrected. I really do think that you have, and I chose a kind, I think my joke about Panglossian was intended to be kind rather than savage. But there's a final point I want to make. In the book, you were scrabbling to find Lee Kuan Yew. I scrabbled in the index. I found a single reference to Muslim, and it was persecuted Muslims. The entire omission of this gigantic cultural change in our country, the desperate attempts of our global elite, our globalizing elite, to pretend that multiculturalism is wonderful and that diversity is our strength. What Neil Ferguson has referred to, you mentioned the Soviet Union, Ferguson has given an analysis of Britain and indeed much of the West as one that's also based on noble lies. And you've not addressed at all that sense of omnipresent discontent. It's not just invented, is it, by Farage? Farage is exploiting things, of course, but he's not inventing them. The discontents are real, aren't they? And none of what you've said seems to me to, frankly, address them.
Well, I've written a book about Britain's role in the world. In June, I will publish my next book, which is about how to fix our economy. And the following year, I'll publish my final book of this Parliament, which is How to Fix Our Democracy. So I don't pretend I address all those issues in this book. But when it comes to Britain's role in the world, I think we have lost our confidence but we have a lot we can be proud of. There's a lot of potential, and I think we should get our mojo back at a time when the world is becoming very dangerous. As you say, the rules-based order is, I don't think it's collapsed, but it's in a period of transition. And if we don't want to move to a violent Hobbesian state of nature in global affairs where countries are, borders are being regularly trampled on and countries are being invaded, then countries which do have a sensible idea about how to order things internationally need to roll their sleeves up. And I think Britain should be one of those. So that would be my first point. My second point, this point you make about multiculturalism, well, this is not a book about what happens inside Britain, but I do have a chapter on the migration crisis. And let me tell you where I'm coming from on this. I am married to a foreigner. I think that one of the best things about this country is the fact that over centuries we have welcomed the brightest and the best from all over the world, whether it was the Huguenots, the Jews, people who've come from our colonies. London has always been one of the world's most successful cities at integrating people from many, many different backgrounds.
Very small
Let me
numbers.
finish. Let me
Very
finish.
small numbers.
Let me finish. Thank you. And if you look at our Nobel Prizes, where we're second only to the United States in the number of Nobel Prizes we've won, a third of them have been won by people who were born abroad and came to the UK to do their studies. I think that's been intrinsic to our success, but I am worried, which is why I take the position that perhaps would surprise some people, that we should be willing, if necessary, to leave the ECHR. I am worried that the social contract that has allowed us for centuries to attract the brightest and best from all over the world is under threat because we've failed to tackle illegal migration. And for that reason, and I think we do need to do much better, and we need to stop the small boats, and people need to have confidence that the people who come here will be people who come here legally. And that's why I think we have to be very honest that if we don't tackle illegal migration and bring down legal migration to sustainable levels, which I do think was a failure of the last government, then we will break that social contract. And that great tradition of openness, which has been the making of this university and many other universities across the country, will be under threat. And so that's why I think we have to be balanced and pragmatic in order to sustain what I think has been one of the fundamental contributors to our success as a country over many years.
Again, we agree, but of course, the reality has been so different, hasn't it, in recent years? I mean, you look,
as I just said,
as you just said, nice actually. We can end on a semi-note of agreement. We've also, I'm ashamed to say, excluded our audience. Have we a moment that we could have the odd question, perhaps? Could we have a microphone?
Good.
Sir. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeremy. Can you hear me? Yes. So in the light of our role in the world, was Brexit a mistake?
It's an interesting question. I voted to remain, but I'm not sure I would vote to go back in if there was a referendum tomorrow. I think there has been some economic cost to Brexit, but I look at the decision-making in the EU, and it is so sclerotic and so hopeless that I worry that we just wouldn't be able to get our economy back on its feet if we had to go back into that system where everything has to be agreed by 27 or 28 countries. So my view on Brexit is we're quite big enough to make a success of it. There's no reason why a country the size of Britain can't be a successful independent country like Canada or Australia or Japan. You have to have a different economic model when you're outside the single market, but I've absolutely no doubt we can make a great success of it. But I'm just not convinced that the EU is going to get its act together economically, and I'm worried that they are going to, and by the way, I think it's bad for us as well that that's the case, because we need them to pay for their own defence just as we need to. So that's where I stand.
Sir, could we hear? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Jeremy, do you think one of our problems is that we have too many commentators speaking down about our nation, as David Starkey does?
Do you know, I actually, I really like the fact that we put our politicians on the spot and they have really tough interviews, and you wake up and hear them being grilled on the Today programme. And I think that's actually a very healthy thing about our democracy. But the one negative about it is that I think it makes people think that we're being led by a bunch of incompetent, venal, corrupt idiots. And I'm not saying that that's never the case, but if you, and this is something where I think John Bew and you, David, might disagree with me, but I became Chancellor in rather unexpected circumstances in October 2022. Markets collapsing around my ears, inflation at 11%, Bank of England saying we were going to have the longest recession in 100 years. And I think if you'd been a fly in the wall in my office in the Treasury, brand new, rookie Chancellor, not an economist, surrounded by all these brilliant Oxbridge firsts who were the Treasury officials advising me, I actually think you'd have been quite impressed. I think it was, I think Britain is quite good in a crisis. I think the state actually works. I think the way COBRA meetings work, all obviously completely secret, but I actually think they're quite impressive. So I think the reality is, I think, by the way, most politicians are trying to do the right thing for the country. And the sort of charade of PMQs doesn't really represent the reality of what it's like when a Secretary of State is back in his or her department. So I think that's, although the accountability is good, I think that is the downside. It perhaps gives a slightly over-negative impression of the people who are taking these important decisions.
Perhaps one final question as we're... Sir, could we? Thank you.
Thank you. So the discussion is, it's been a really interesting, brilliant discussion, but there seems to be sort of very polar opposite positions where I wonder they don't necessarily have to be polar opposite. So, David, you spoke a bit about the necessity of the radical restructuring of government as sort of the primary need of our state now, as opposed to, Jeremy, you speaking about us being able to be an example for other nations, and that be sort of a method by which we exercise our soft power. And I'm just wondering whether or not, it seems to me like those two things don't have to be mutually exclusive. And could they not sort of be tied together in a way that our radical restructuring of government to get our state back on its feet and so that we can sort of stand tall as a nation and be where we want to be and we be where we need to be? Could those two positions sort of not come together into one?
I think they could come together, but the important thing is where we begin. What I've been trying to say is, and I think there is absolutely abundant evidence, we haven't talked about the extent to which a huge part, you were talking about criticism. The people who do the most violent criticism are half our politicians who are you talk favorably of empire. As you know, that's a profoundly unfashionable view with at least half of our political class. The work of demolition is an internal one. Again, very much associated with many of the views on human rights, international law, generally speaking, of the left. Now, I believe that if we were able to get ourselves right, then the world that Jeremy is talking about is entirely possible. But we were only able to do that when we were a major, successful economic power. And when we also, and my view of a successful economy, I believe actually it's the other way around. I think you have to get the politics right before the economy gets right. The reason that Britain, England, primarily becomes this extraordinarily innovative thing that you've talked about is our politics. It's the development of representative government, of the rule of law, of freedom of discourse. We have, if you look in the Middle Ages, we are not a great economic power. The process is one that develops essentially in the 17th century when we solve a very great political dispute, and this lightning growth of Britain, intellectually exactly coinciding with this building. But it's the power industrially, the power commercially, the power intellectually. In other words, this is why, I'm afraid, I did say Panglossian, but it seems to me this notion of soft power is just fundamentally, profoundly misleading. It's a gossamer. It is something in which you can drape yourself. It's a drapery that protects you from the reality of decline. And we pursued a will-o'-the-wisp. That's my argument. I want to be the world that you've described, Jeremy. What I'm trying to do is to talk about how we escape from our present and once again, get back. Ladies and gentlemen.
Oh, hang on, I've got to answer the question.
Okay, all right.
Thank you very much.
Actually, I'm just aware of time.
I know, but you can't have the last word like that.
Well, of course you can.
Yes, I know. I just think it's interesting, isn't it, that you despise soft power until I point out that one of the biggest elements of it is our universities, and then you say you actually rather like it. And I think it's about politics and economics. And I make two very brief points. On the politics, it's always been messy throughout British history at our most powerful moments. When the empire was at the height of its influence, politics in Westminster was incredibly messy. It was ever thus. It needs reforming. Lots of things could be done better. But don't think there was some magical period in history when everyone in Westminster behaved like grown-ups. They never have, and they never will. And number two, when it comes to the economy, which really does matter, don't forget the biggest secret about the UK, which is that after the United States and China, we have the biggest tech sector in the world, only one of three in the world worth more than $1 trillion. And that has happened because of a quiet revolution in our universities, where it's not just Oxford and Cambridge that have these enormous science and business parks. Nearly all our universities are nurturing the most incredible spin-outs. And that is why I think we should be a bit more optimistic about our future. Thank you.